Good evening and welcome to the Catalan Cymru's revision sessions. This session will focus on History AS level and will be presented by me, Mr. Andrew Morel, from Ysgol Uchaf Llanidloes High School. The session will last around 45 minutes where I'll go through some of the content and if you have any questions at all, please post them in the top right hand corner of the Q&A function. The session will be recorded, and the recording and any relevant resources, the stuff I go through, will be uploaded on the e-sgol website in the Catalan Cymru section. So, without further ado, here we go. Welcome back. Thank you very much for coming back. Thank you very much for listening to this second recording. It is good that you are taking such an interest. So, last session, what we did was we looked at Unit 2 and how to master Question 1. Today, then, we're going to do the same, but for Question 2, right? So Unit 2 again, Question 2, that interpretation-based question. Just a heads up in terms of where we're going for the future weeks. Next week, we'll be looking at how to manage the content and focusing on the concepts within Unit 1. And then the week after, looking at specific techniques to help you writing your essay or planning your essay, which obviously feeds in to writing. So, History AS is made up of two units, Unit 1 and Unit 2. Now, Unit 1 is a breadth study. It means it's a much longer time period, but you don't need to know it in as much depth. And that will be, as we'll see from next week, that it will be Section A and Section B, where you choose one from two essay questions in both. So there's an element of choice in both. And the exam total ends an hour and 30 minutes. Unit 2 then, the depth study, the one we're looking at today, has got one compulsory source question, Question 1, which we looked at last session, and then Question 2, a compulsory interpretation-based question, one that we're going to look at today. Just to recap that, source means something that's made at the time, a contemporary document, whilst an interpretation is something made after the time. By reflecting on what's happened, by using a number of sources, you create your interpretation. And so the exam for this is an hour and 3/4. Now, you will be studying one of these topics, right? You'll be studying either the mid-Tudor crisis in Wales and England, or royalty, rebellion and republic, or reform and protest in Wales and England, or politics and society in Wales and England, or religious reformation in Europe, France and revolution, crisis of the American public, or Germany, democracy and dictatorship. That'll be the content you'll be doing. Now, I'm not going to focus on the content because if I did, as I said last session, if I did, then I would be wasting everyone else's time unless you did that specific option. So instead, I'm going to be looking at that Question 2, and it's going to give you skills that can apply across the different units, different option subjects, different option topics that you would have done in your school or in your college. Now, in terms of content, right, the following website is useful because it helps you to make yourself aware of the content, right? By following that link, you can find out what is on the specification for the specific topic you're doing, right? By clicking on the specification document, that is what you can find. Scroll down, find the topic you're doing, and you'll be able to pick it up from there if your teacher or lecturer hasn't already given it to you. So today then, right, we're going to be focusing on this interpretation-based question, Question 2. Now, this diagram we saw last session, right? Last session we focused on the source-based question, 30 marks. Both of them are 30 marks, in fact, so big hitters, only 2 questions. Both are compulsory. There is no choice. The good thing, though, in some ways, is that the source and the interpretations give you a lot of what you need for the exam. Yes, you need content, but the sources, the interpretations give you a lot about what you're actually going to use in the exam anyway. So this is where I get my big crystal ball out, as I did last time, and I look into the future and I tell you that Question 2 will always look the same. Just like Question 1 will always look the same, so will Question 2. It will always be phrased like this, right? Historians have made different interpretations about blank. Analyze, evaluate, and use the 2 extracts above and your understanding of historical evidence to debate a historical debate to answer the following question. How valid is the view that blank, 30 marks? It will always look like that. No matter what option, no matter what year the question paper is, it will always look like that. It will also, unfortunately, be compulsory. There's no choice, but nonetheless, you're getting a good heads up here. So let's prove that, right? This is the option 4 exam from 2019. You've got the two interpretations there, and then the question. Historians have made different interpretations about the changing fortunes of blank, in this case, the Liberal Party up to 1914. Analyse and evaluate and use the two extracts above in your understanding of historical debate to answer the following questions. How valid is the view that blank, and in this case, that blank is the Liberal Party was largely in decline by 1914. Same thing here. Option 7, 2018 exam, right? Again, we can see that the question is historians have made different interpretations about the causes of, same thing as before, blank, in this case, the American Civil War. Analyze, evaluate, and use it in extracts above your understanding of historical debate to answer the following question. How valid is the view that blank, in this case, the blank is slavery was mainly responsible for causing the American Civil War? So there we are, right? Proof is the same. One last time then, right? Just so you don't think I'm making this up. Historians have made different interpretations about blank, in this case, the reason for the Nazi rise to power. Analyze, evaluate, and use the two extracts above in your understanding of historical debate to answer the following question. How valid is the view that blank, in this case, Hitler was mainly responsible for the rise to power of the Nazis by 1933? So you can see, can't you, right, that no matter what the option, no matter what year the exam paper came from, my crystal ball is absolutely right. The question will always be phrased the same. It'll just be on a different concept or topic. So a couple of pointers about these interpretations, right? Well, firstly, both interpretations will have been made after the time. These are not sources, right? These are not contemporary. They will almost certainly both be written, right? There's space in the exam board for them to give you a pictorial interpretation, but I highly, highly doubt it. You should use around 10 minutes to evaluate the sources and about 50 minutes to write up your response. And that's how I proportion the time out if I was you sitting this exam. And you'll also need to consider the strengths and limitations of the provider's interpretations within the context of the specific key issue. Now, that is absolutely fundamental. It's not about the strengths and limitations of that interpretation for helping you study the depth study as a whole, the topic you've been doing as a whole. It's within the context of the specific key issue in the question. In this case, right, let's change the color. In this question here, right, the specific issue, reasons for the Nazi rise to power. In this one, causes of the American Civil War. In this one, changing fortunes of the Liberal Party. It's not about whether or not these help to explain everything about the topic you've been doing, but that specific key issue in the question. Now, historians, more pointed on these interpretations, right? Historians may make and debate different interpretations based on a number of considerations, right? What means they've got different opinions on the same thing is things like the availability of primary evidence. When they're writing, the closer they're writing to the time, the less availability of primary evidence there probably is likely to be, unless we're talking hundreds of years later, when some of this evidence might have been destroyed. The emphasis that they place on particular events and developments. Some historians will place different emphasis on different events and different developments. Some might place greater emphasis on the role of individuals and the developments that individuals do. Others might place much more greater emphasis on the economy and the impact that the economy has. Historians may also make different interpretations based on their focus on the varying importance of political, social, religious, economic, and other aspects of history. First World War is a classic example of this. You have very, very different interpretations from historians that look at the development of technology in war than those that look at the social impact of war. If you're writing about the development of technology in the First World War, you tend to be quite positive. If you're writing about the perspective of ordinary soldiers in the trenches, you tend to be incredibly negative. And also the influence of other historians who represent a similar school of thought. These historians aren't just reading these sources in isolation. They will have spent years and years reading the work of other historians, engaging in debate and discussion with those other historians. And so as a result, These interpretations are always provisional and can always be challenged. You will see historians that over the course of their lifetime will change their interpretation, will challenge their own interpretation, will challenge others' interpretations, but challenge their own. And as I say then, historians themselves will even change their own interpretations. So in this aspect of the assessment then, there is no requirement or expectation for any reference to historiography, to that story of history. But if you know it though, there is no harm in using it. Particularly given some sources might, or some interpretations might refer to so-and-so being a revisionist historian. So even though it's not expecting you to debate that and explain that in your answer, there's still use in knowing these three in particular. The first being traditionalists. These are historians that are writing quite often very close to the events, and they're often emotionally attached to the event. They might have relatives who were involved in the event. They might have lost relatives, in fact, who were involved in the event, or they might owe their position to what happened in the event. And they follow quite closely the opinions of the time that were found in newspapers and among politicians writing around the time. Because their primary evidence base isn't that big, they've got what's been published. Revisionist historians then tend to come a little bit later. And these historians are writing later and are revising, are changing the historical record. You can even have a group called neo-revisionists, right? Who are, or counter-revisionists, who are revising the revisionist perspective. They're changing the changed perspective, right? It's like a cycle. We change, and then we change the change, and then we change back again. But nonetheless, revisionists change. Whilst Marxist historians, they focus closely really on the role of ordinary people in events, and often see the economy or changes in the economy as the reason for that event in the first place. So as I said, right, the exam board has said specifically there's no requirement or expectation for you to reference that historiography, but I think it's really good to know those three in particular. So what I wanted to do first, right, before we actually look at that question in detail, is I wanted us to think about this, right? These are different types of source or interpretation you might be given, right? And so what you need to be doing, right, in order to help you, is thinking in advance how and why this interpretation might have been formed and whether or not it adds to the validity of it. So a historian, right, quite simply, has studied the event, right? Studied the event. And as a result, they've invested time in it. They will be trained in it. It's not just someone who's turned up. I apologize profusely for my handwriting, but nonetheless, right? It's not just someone who's turned up and had a go at it. So if you're thinking about the validity of that, it does increase the validity of it because they've looked at a broad range of sources. They are trained in it. They've studied the event rather than just passing judgment on something they've seen on social media or something. Now, a specialist book, right, tends to focus in more on a specific event. Now, I suggested you're filling this in, right? And you can come back to this because these recordings are online. You can come back to this and do this in more detail and run it past your teacher and lecturer. You add a little bit more detail, okay? But nonetheless, I'm giving you a general idea here. The specialist book will focus in on the events, right? Depends what it's specialist in, but it will almost certainly, the interpretation in the exam, it will tell you if it's a specialist book or what it's a specialist on. So again, it adds to the validity of that source. That historian is more of a specialist, right? So a bit of a compliment, isn't it, to call someone a specialist? Now, history journals tend to be peer-reviewed, right? This is the key point for this. Because what happens is in order to publish in this journal, other historians, the editor, who's a historian, will have read the article, will have passed some comment on it, it will have been edited and things like that. Newspaper articles, right? These can still be interpretations because sometimes newspapers will go back and they'll look at what's happened in the past. They will tend to be journalists rather than historians. And so journalists are much more writing in order to publish their newspaper. They're not trained historians, and so that ultimately reduces the validity of that type of source. Political historians look at the perspective often of government, right? Or maybe even politicians themselves. So if the question, the specific key issue in the question, like that one of the Liberal Party, is about the decline of the Liberal Party, then a political historian is going to be very useful there, very valid, because what they're doing is they're looking specifically at the perspective of government and politics and political parties. Whilst economic historians look more at the economy, right, and the impact of the economy and that perspective. So that would be less useful, less valid in terms of studying the decline of the Liberal Party, for example. Social historian tends to do the same sort of thing, right? They're focusing on people in particular, right? The interactions of people. So again, right, you can't just say all social history is more valid or all political history is more valid. It's got to be in the context of the key issue that the question is on. So in this case, going back to that Liberal Party, decline of Liberal Party, social historian would almost certainly be less valid, less useful than a political historian because their perspective is just focused elsewhere. They're focusing on those interactions between people out there in the country and the impact that government has on ordinary people, rather than the machinations, the to's and fro's of political parties. Now, sources can come out at different times. If they're dated before 1991, then that is before the decline of the USSR. Now, it doesn't really matter for some of our subjects, right? But for others, it might. And again, it's about looking at that key issue, that key concept, isn't it? If it's about relations in Europe, for example, then absolutely it's going to matter whether that's released before the decline of USSR and evidence is open up, or whether it's released after. So this is then after decline. And the important thing about this is after the decline of USSR, you start to see their perspective being published and being used by historians. They were able to access those archives within the Soviet Union or the satellite states to the Soviet Union, like East Germany. So if we're thinking, the example I'm going to look at later in terms of the rise of the Nazi Party, Hitler within the Nazi Party, then which split Germany, split into East and West Germany, then this is a big watershed moment because historians of the West were able then to access archival material that had been held within East Germany and hadn't been allowed to be read by historians. Biography and autobiography tend to be focused on individuals. So a biography is something that is like a history of an individual, whilst an autobiography is something that someone has written about themselves, a history of themselves. So it tends to often be quite limited in their perspective or in their focus because it focuses on the individual. But then having said that, if the key question or the key issue in the question is asking about the role of a specific individual, then their biography might be very helpful. One thing biographies do tend to do, and I'll warn you of this now, is they tend to overplay the importance of that individual because it's almost like they're trying to justify why they're writing that book. There's no point writing a biography about someone who's not very important, is there? Textbooks tend to be quite general, right? They're useful because you as historians, as students of history, are using textbooks. They give you really good information, but they tend to be quite general. An intentionalist historian tends to focus on the kind of decisions made by people on their intentions, right? On them choosing to make a decision, choosing to take that step and choosing to kind of push things forward. Whilst a structuralist historian tends to focus much more on the structure of government. Or just the structures in the country. And so they will tend to downplay the idea that an individual can be that important. Because ultimately they're saying without those structures, this wouldn't have happened in the first place. Without those institutions, for example, it wouldn't have happened in the first place. And a dissertation tends to be written by a student, right? There are some very, very interesting things written in dissertations, but they're written by students ultimately, not by historians who've been doing this for years and years and years. So just some key words, key kind of descriptive words for the interpretations that might come up in the interpretation that you're given in your exam. And all the while you're thinking about, does this make this more or less valid within the issue, within the context of that key issue in the question. So, historians debating the political and economic instability of early Weimar period may represent schools of thought such as the following, right? They might have the interpretation that instability was due to deep-rooted economic problems. Now, that interpretation will tend to have come from someone who's looking at economic history, who's an economic historian. And they might use the context of the economic cost of war and the position of the Treaty of Versailles as supporting evidence for that. Whilst other historians, right, looking at the same thing, the instability of early Weimar, might come to a different interpretation. They might say that instability was due to developments outside of the control of the Republic. Their school of thought is a lot more external causal, right? We're looking at the structures maybe of Europe as a whole and the power play between Europe as a whole. And they might use, for example, the impact of Versailles and how other countries imposed Versailles on Germany, or the invasion of the Ruhr, how that is the thing that gives you evidence for that interpretation. So dropping down another one, right? So another interpretation on the same period, instability in the early Weimar Republic, might be that instability was caused by political attempts to destabilize the Republic by extremist groups. This is a political interpretation. It's focusing on the politics in particular. And they might use the Spartan Cap revolts as evidence to justify that interpretation. So you can see kind of that the same event will have different interpretations. So as question 2 will always look the same, right? Here's a checklist of what we always need to do to apply, and we'll keep coming back to this. Discuss the interpretation in a question, identify the interpretations in the extracts, use the content to show how and why the interpretation being made or differed, use the authorship to suggest how and why the interpretation may have been made and differ to others, offer an alternative judgment, and then ultimately, as you have to do with question 1 as well, provide a judgment. So here's our checklist, and here's what we'll keep coming back to. Now, if this is the question, historians have made different interpretations about the reasons for Nazi rise to power. Analyze, evaluate, and use the 2 extracts above in your understanding of historical debate to answer the following question. How valid is the view that Hitler was mainly responsible for the rise to power of the Nazis by 1933? So, the interpretation in the question clearly shows that Hitler was mainly responsible for the rise to power of the Nazis. It's got that written here, right? Mainly responsible. Hitler was mainly responsible. It was him and his personal actions, including his great oratory during his many speeches, his political organization, his leadership of the Nazi Party, his publication of a Mein Kampf, which detailed clearly his views, could all then be part of that interpretation, all things that he specifically did. Now, what I've done there is I've summarized this interpretation, but this can become your introduction. You don't need to do any more than that for your introduction. Just sum up what the interpretation in the question is and give a couple of bits that might back that up. In this case, what things Hitler did, speeches, publication of Mein Kampf, etc. This bit of our checklist, done and dusted. Secondly then, you need to identify the interpretation in the extract. So interpretation 1 here says, the main reason for the growing strength of the Nazis was Hitler's appeal and the force of his personality. It was his ability to get out into Germany's provincial cities and mobilize people politically who were alienated from the established parties or who had no real experience of a democratic tradition. Hitler was not part of the traditional political classes. Hitler was a man of the people whose own efforts, as he constantly reminds his listeners, had dragged him from local obscurity to national prominence. He promised to take the problems of his ordinary supporters and give them a national platform. So this interpretation really clearly shows that the main reason for the growing strength was Hitler's appeal, the force of his personality. It was the fact that he was a man of the people. So he was mainly responsible for the rise to power, and so backs up that interpretation in the question. And you can write that. Interpretation 1 backs up the interpretation in the question that Hitler was mainly responsible for the rise to power of the Nazis, because it tells us that Hitler had growing strength because of his personal appeal, the force of his personality. In contrast then, if we look at interpretation 2 tells us In bringing the Nazis to power, chance events played a larger role than any actions of the Nazi leader himself. 5 years earlier, the Nazi Party had been a fringe irritant in German politics, but no more than that. External events, the Young Plan to adjust German reparations, the Wall Street crash and Bruning's entirely unnecessary decision to have an election in the summer of 1930 put the Nazis on the political map. Although democracy in Germany by that time seemed to have an unpromising future, the Nazi dictatorship under Hitler seemed far less likely than any other form of authoritarian dictatorship or even a restored monarchy. So the interpretation of this extract is that it was instead much more chance that saw the Nazis rise to power. Without the Wall Street crash, without the Young Plan, without the catastrophic decision to have an election in the summer of 1930, Hitler wouldn't have raised to power. And so it disagrees with the interpretation in the question. And that's simply what you would write. So we've identified the interpretations in the extracts. And what you can do for that, what I suggest you do that, like I did, is highlight them, jot some little notes beside of it before you even start writing. Because you're going to take, and I'll show you in the end the structure you'll look at interpretation 1, do everything for interpretation 1, then do everything for interpretation 2 as well. So we've identified those interpretations in the extract. Now this is where you get into more of the kind of specifics as you're writing, looking at the content. What content in that source backs up the interpretation, in this case, that Hitler was mainly responsible for the rise to power. So in this one, Hitler's personality and his appeal, he was a man of the people, his organizational skills, his presence, his propaganda were content, or are content that backs this up. And it's all part of what we call this great man theory, the culmination of one man's ability, one man's ambition. It is intentionalist, right? He is intended to get into power, and so he does it. Whilst for interpretation 2, the specific content that backs up the interpretation that it was instead more chance is the fact that there was the Depression. The Young Plan, Bruning's election failed to prevent the Nazis rising to power. And so chance events are much more important than leadership, and would have been more likely than would have been more likely that it had been a restoration of monarchy than Hitler in the first place. Understandable. This is more what we'd call structuralist, probably, right? The structures of society around it helped Hitler rise to power rather than what he specifically intended to do or what he was able to do personally. So there, we've looked at the content, right? How and why this interpretation may be made and differ, where we've looked at the specific facts, specific details in that content that hopefully explains it. So after that, sorry, I've skipped ahead. After that, we need to look at authorship. Who made it? When did they make it? What was the purpose? What was the audience? By looking at those things, we again can say how and why this interpretation may have been made and may differ to the other interpretation. So in this case, the authorship is a man called Richard Overy, right? And what's good about him is that he is an academic historian. So that means he is well trained, like we talked about earlier with historians. It means he's got a lot of time in order to invest in researching this, something we said about being a historian earlier. He's also a specialist in modern European history. So what he's doing is he is able to look at it within the context of probably the 20th century, the 1900s. He's not a historian of early modern Europe or ancient Europe. If he was, we'd be more skeptical again about this. So those are the positives. Those are things that add to the validity of this interpretation. Nonetheless, it is a big area, right? Looking at modern Europe is a big area. It's not just Germany, is it? It's also published in a magazine, right, called the Modern History Review. Now, a magazine isn't peer-reviewed. Just like I said earlier with a history journal, historians who are editors of a journal, things like that, will read it, will check it, will make changes, make suggestions. That doesn't happen with magazines. Magazines just published based on that perspective. It's also thinking about it being modern history, right? And it's the Modern History Review. So his interpretation may be less precise and less specifically researched, right? It's Modern History Review isn't talking about modern Germany isn't talking about Germany under the Nazis or under the Weimar Republic. It's about modern history review. So if you think about it, what could be published in that, right? The Brexit referendum could be published in that. That's modern history. The French Revolution, to some people, could be published in that because they define that as modern history. So French Revolution back in 1789 up until a Brexit referendum in 2016, it's a huge span of time, isn't it? And it could be across the whole world, right? We could look at Pol Pot over in Cambodia, right? That could be published in the Modern History Review as well. On the other hand, then, if we look at Ian Kershaw, right, Interpretation 2, Ian Kershaw, an academic historian and specialist in Nazi Germany, writing in a specialist book called Hitler, published in 1991. What else can we say? Well, he is an academic historian, again, so same positive as before, but he is a specialist in Nazi Germany. He is a specialist in this time period, and that's going to make it more valid. So it will be specific and it will be deeply researched. He will have looked at vast ranges of sources. Now, if we also look, right, sorry, we'll come on to that in a second, skipping ahead there. What's negative? What reduces the validity of this? Well, it's based on more short-termism. The Depression only happened in 1929, and then it suggests that that could be the reason for the rise of Hitler. So that means that in the space of just 3 years, 4 years, it explains everything why Hitler has risen to power. It's not looking further back than 1929, really, and giving reasons for deep dissatisfaction with Weimar from the early period, maybe. And also, it's written in 1991 at the fall of communism, which ultimately fell due to economics, right? Due to the failure of the USSR to support itself economically. And so, he might be linking the two, mightn't he? He might be saying, well, that's why the USSR collapsed, and so that might be why the Weimar Republic collapsed. Could be linking the two. He could have been persuaded or changed by the current day phenomenon, things that were happening as he was writing his book. Also in 1991, you haven't necessarily had the opening up of those East German archives at this point. So he may only be able to get things from the West German archives, which only gives you doesn't give you a whole view of what people were thinking in Germany at the time. Particularly as Berlin, or large sections of Berlin, the capital, were in East Germany. So what we've done there is we've looked at the authorship, right? Who made it? When they made it? What purpose? What audience? And then to show how and why the interpretation may have been made and may differ to the others. By understanding that Ian Kershaw specializes in Nazi Germany rather than just in modern European history, we can see why his interpretation might differ. By understanding that Ian Kershaw was writing in 1991 at the fall of communism due to economics, as opposed to 1989, a few years before when the USSR was still kind of going strong, we can see why there might be a difference in idea as to why Weimar might have collapsed. So, next thing you need to do is highlight an alternative interpretation, right? And this is one provided from your own knowledge, right? This is reliant on your revision rather than on the information given to you in the exam itself. So it's expected that you'll be aware of a range of possible interpretations of these key issues made by historians. But specific knowledge and recall of particular historians in their careers or publications isn't required, right? When in the alternative interpretation, you're not required to give a name of a historian and say, as a Marxist historian, they think something different because of this. It's just giving that alternative interpretation. After analysing and looking at the strengths and limitations of it, and evaluating the validity of those two provided interpretations on that specific issue, in this case, the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party, you need to show then an awareness of a different interpretation of the issue set. So, this link here on the website at the bottom, which you should be able to click on, or should be clickable on the resources uploaded to the Catalan Cymru website, will take you to a good source of these alternative interpretations. As it says there, this website link takes you to the WJC Exam Board produced resource, and the resource provides you examples of interpretation areas for each of those options 1 to 8 for Unit 2. So, for example, right, our key issue in the question has been about the Nazi rise to power. And so, as it tells here, it's given you those different ones. There's an interpretation that the Nazi rose to power mainly because of the leadership of Hitler. That was the interpretation in the question, wasn't it? Learners should evaluate the interpretation of the Nazi rose to power mainly because of the leadership of Hitler and compare its validity against the interpretation that the policies of the Weimar government were to blame for the rise of the Nazis. Learners should compare the validity of the interpretation regarding the role of Hitler and the Weimar government of the Nazis' rise with another possible interpretation that the main reason for the rise and support of the Nazis was the hatred of the Versailles settlement in Germany. Well, that is definitely not an interpretation we've come across so far in this question. The one in the question was that it was Hitler, and the same in interpretation 1. In interpretation 2, it was the failures of the Weimar government. This different interpretation is that it was the hatred of the Versailles settlement that lots of people supported in Germany. So it's a different interpretation, and that is what I mean you can include in that alternative interpretation. Here again, it gives you another one, a further interpretation that could form part of the wider debate, so that the rise of Nazis can be best explained due to their use of effective propaganda. So it could be a different alternative interpretation you include. So what this does is this gives you a pointer to your alternative interpretation. There'll be 2 interpretations in the question. You will need an alternative. So on every element, right, you will need 3 interpretations, just in case that bit comes up in the exam. Because if you've got 3, 2 will be in the question. You've always got your 3rd one ready to go. So there we are. We have given our alternative interpretation. Now that does require you to back it up with some contextual information, some things that you know and you can give specific details to add to. But nonetheless, right, that is your alternative interpretation. It's just fleshing out. It's just giving some context of a different viewpoint on the key issue in the question. And lastly, then, you need to make a judgment in light of all of this, right? In light of the validity of the set interpretation. So, in order to test the interpretation's validity, you may like to consider the following issues in making those judgments. What is the interpretation that's being made? In order to judge is it valid or not, you need to know what interpretation it is. What historical support is there for this interpretation? What factual information is there that supports the idea, in this case, that Hitler was the main cause for the rise of Nazis to power? How does this interpretation fit into the wider historical debate? So in this case, is it an early interpretation? Is it a later interpretation? Is it more a social interpretation or an economic interpretation? In this case, right, the idea of it being Hitler is probably more political. We could almost say in Kershaw on the Depression and the Wall Street crash, we could almost say that's more economic. How valid or convincing is this interpretation when you compare it to others? That's ultimately what we're thinking of, right? Is that one that's in the question, is that more convincing to you as a historian than the other interpretation in the other extract or the alternative interpretation that you've offered? And you need to do this for each interpretation that is presented to you, right? So at the end of each paragraph, make a judgment on the validity of that interpretation. But then you also need to do an overall one based on the interpretation in the question itself. And that then is you making your judgment. So this is what I mean by that, right? And unlike last week, I suppose, if we didn't do source 1, then source 2, then source 3, so we didn't do interpretation 1 and interpretation 2, we split them by each section, but this hopefully will tie it together and make sense in your head, right? So your introduction is what I said before about what's the interpretation in the question, just setting that out. Paragraph 1 then is identifying and using interpretation 1. It is initially using the content to say how and why interpretation 1's been made, then using the authorship, including its purpose, its audience, the date it was made, to show why it was made and why it differs to others, and then giving a statement or a judgment on its validity. Is it valid? Paragraph 2 then, identifying interpretation in interpretation 2. That should be, not interpretation 1, classic. I'll change it now on the screen. Interpretation 2. Use the content of interpretation 2 to show how it was made. Use the authorship, including the audience and the purpose, to show it's been made and how it differs to interpretation 1. And then again, make a judgment on interpretation 2's validity. Whilst paragraph 3 then is you offering that alternative interpretation using your own knowledge of events, fleshing it out using specific facts, specific details that you know of. And then conclusion is your overall summary. Overall, how valid is the interpretation in the question? Is it more or less valid than these other two interpretations? Which one ultimately would you say is the most valid explanation for the key issue in the question? In this case, the rise of the Nazis. Is it the role of Hitler? Is it the role of the Wall Street crash and the Depression? Or is it the role of the Nazis' use of propaganda? They're your choices. And then your conclusion is where you make your decision. Which one actually was it? So, a couple of top tips, right? You're not only trying to identify differences in the interpretation, but also trying to discuss how and why they have been formed in the first place. Why are they different? You should debate and offer a judgment on the key issue set and consider a number of interpretations within the wider historical debate over the issue. However is a really good way of doing it. If you're trying to offer a different judgment, a different viewpoint, however is a good phrase to use. And you should be aware that developments in history can be seen in a variety of ways and are able then to appreciate that interpretations are formed for certain reasons and that they're provisional and open to challenge and change. Ian Kershaw, for example, might have changed his interpretation since 1991 as to why Hitler rose to power. He might say something different, because historians are allowed to change their interpretations as they find new evidence, as they get new perspectives, as other events happen that shape their thinking. And so, just a little reminder, this is our checklist for question 1 sources, right? Identifying a key issue in the question, looking at the provenance of the source, the content, the tone, the context, reliability, and judgment. And for question 2, discussing the interpretation in the question, identifying the interpretations in the extracts, content, looking at how and why that has made the interpretation and how and why it differs, looking at the authorship, who made it, when they made it, what purpose of it, and then alternative interpretation and judgment. So between those two, those are your checklists for question 1 and question 2. Things for you to apply when you're doing some past paper questions now and in preparation, memorizing really in turn, ready for the exam so you can go stage by stage by stage in the exam itself. So that's our second session done. Question 2, Unit 2, how to master it. Next week then we'll look at how to manage content and focusing on the concepts in AS level history in Unit 1. And then the week after we'll look at essay writing, some tips for essay writing.